Hello, everybody. My name is Dustin Cormier. Today I'm going to be discussing a very special plant ally. She is a jungle jaguar-hearted dark mistress of shamanic sorcery, love, truth, and spiritual guidance. Her name is Jurema. Some of you might know her as Mimosa Hostilis, Mimosa Tenuiflora. It is a plant that has been used for a long time in Brazil in particular. Today we're going to discuss several articles as well as my own rendition of my own experiences with this wonderful plant. As I'm a gringo living in Canada, I'm kind of new to the subject compared to people who have already done greater work on it. So that's why I'm presenting some literature here from people who are closer to the subject than I am. I'm particularly interested in sharing a courageous and brave article by someone special to the Jurema movement, who's known by the moniker of Yatra. Her work can be found widely in Spanish and Portuguese, and less so in English. But she does have an article in English, which I found through the great website called Erowid.com. But before I get there, there's a few introductory articles I'd like to discuss. Now, the following is this is an excerpt from an article featured in the starrycave.com from February 8th to 2023. This was used as an introduction to a symposium on Jurema in the Brazilian city of Extrema at that time. And this is what it says. So first of all, Jurema is a term that refers to two different but interrelated subjects. It's the plant species, Mimosa Hostilis, but Jurema is also a cultural tradition. It's a whole, like ayahuasca in that way. When we say ayahuasca, we don't just mean the plant, we mean the whole tradition involved with the use of that plant. And Jurema is the same way. The Jurema plant is native to South America, and it belongs to the species Andanenthera peregrina, also known as Mimosa Tenuiflora or Tabernae montana catherinensis. These plants are commonly used in traditional medicine for medicinal and ceremonial purposes, similar to how ayahuasca and other similar plants are used. Jurema originated in the Amazonian north of Brazil, and it preserves the secrets and mysteries of wood spirits and caboclos, amongst many others. Now, the cult of Jurema is a spiritual tradition that involves plant sacraments, it's the smoke of different herbs, and the teaching of disincarnated masters and mistresses. This is a common part of the Jurema ceremony. These disincarnated masters and mistresses give access to the mysteries held by enchanted spirits, the spirits of the wood, teaching spirits, and a wide array of other traditions and mysteries that are used to describe the consciousness that is within and comes through these plants, the Jurema. Now, the Jurema culture is centered around the use of this Jurema plant. The sacrament facilitates spiritual healing, provides guidance and protection, and promotes a deeper connection with the divine, all very similar to ayahuasca. And Jurema culture is understood to be like the tree itself. It's a tree of many branches that today finds itself embedded in many parts of Brazil. It's a rich and dynamic spiritual tradition that reflects the cultural diversity and resilience of this area. It's an abundant and cheap source of the psychedelic DMT molecule, and its roots have been used for centuries in indigenous Brazilian and Afro-Brazilian cultures. So that's the end of that article. Now, I'd like to give a little bit of interesting and confounding history of this plant. We're going to start talking about the Jurema mystery. There's a funny sort of contention happening with it. So, the mystical experience-inducing molecule DMT was isolated and extracted from the Jurema tree, the bark of the Mimosa Hostilis. So and around the 1950s, they found DMT and isolated it in the Jurema plant. So after this discovery, many were led to think that this plant was used traditionally in an entheogenic context as a sort of precursor to spiritual hallucinogenic experiences. However, the strange thing is that while this Jurema tradition has existed for a long time prior to that extraction and isolation discovery, there's a confusing quandary about this plant, which relates to its interesting history. Despite the many observations of Jurema rituals that we've seen for decades that have happened in Brazil, there's actually no ethnographic observation of the plant being used as a hallucinogen. Because the DMT, if you have to understand ayahuasca chemistry to kind of know what's going on here, it's just DMT. There's no potentiator. There's no MAO inhibitor, as you might have heard through ayahuasca. Usually, when you combine DMT, you have to combine it with something in order to make it bioavailable to the body, so that the body can actually digest the DMT without ruining the DMT through that metabolic process. So nowadays, until nowadays, no observation was made of these cultures using Jurema together with an MAO inhibitor. So at most it might be mixed with alcohol in rituals such as those of Catimbo. Now, another article we're going to dig into gives us a little bit more history of what's going on here. It's an article entitled The Jurema Mystery by an author named Luna. The author Luna correctly suggests and I quote, "The lack of observations of this plant being used as a traditional hallucinogen." There's nowadays there's hardly any of the combination of Jurema plant with any hallucinatory potentiator. But just because there isn't today doesn't mean there never was. And this doesn't mean that the practice have never involved a hallucinogenic component. Luna says that, as is the case for many other cultural elements from different indigenous populations in Brazil, it's possible that the knowledge about the hallucinogenic properties of this plant were lost amidst the European invasion and the repression in the years that followed. When the British came in and repressed the indigenous, the Europeans, not British, but the Europeans invaded this area of Brazil, and the combinatory hallucinogenic properties of another plant that might have been used with Jurema might have gotten lost in the shuffle at that time. The idea that there might have been one or more substances that could have been mixed with Jurema during rituals in the past. This is what's called the Jurema mystery. So what would it have been? Was it a thing? Because it's amazing to think of how much spirituality, how much of the plant spirit speaking to people through the drinking of the Jurema wine, how much of a living spirit is described to the mythos of Jurema. But you read in many of these articles that, a lot of people have heard of Jurema in these areas, but are very disconnected from it and from its history. So the author of this article, Luna, further notes that, indeed, in current Jurema traditions, Jurema is never mixed with any substance that could behave as an MAO inhibitor. In fact, the plant that could possibly lead to a slightly more altered state, that's the black Jurema with thorns. In most cases, this is avoided. They don't drink that one because those conducting the ceremonies say the plant with the thorns make people go crazy and might cause sufferings. So this final quote from that article provides us some context from the article that we're going to read by the enigmatic hero known as Yatra. The author Luna writes that in 1997, a researcher who was then the president of Friends of the Forest Foundation, by the name of Yatra da Silveira Barbosa, traveled to Brazil to learn more about the traditional uses of Jurema. So together with two Brazilian anthropologists, Yatra visited some communities who had been making use of Jurema during some ceremonies to learn a bit more about their practice. To her surprise, she noticed that the communities did not know about the hallucinogenic potential of the Jurema plant when mixed with an MAOI. And so she, being a person who had this understanding, this is in the late 1990s, so she knew about ayahuasca, she knew about this pharmacological chemistry. So she told the native populations about this stuff, about combining it with an MAO. So as Yatra traveled through different communities in Brazil, she showed them the effects of Jurema when combined with an MAOI. Particularly, she used Peganum harmala, also known as Syrian rue. This is a combination that she'd already been researching for some time. For those listening and who might be interested, we have to give a caveat here that Syrian rue needs to be prepared in a certain way in order to not damage the liver. You have to use a aqueous solution. There's ways to do it so that it doesn't cause undue damage to the inner organs. Syrian rue is actually what I use in my Jurema practice as well. So as the communities would experience the effects, a state of unrest would follow, where a reinterpretation of the Jurema rituals would start to be born. So these hallucinogenic properties of the Jurema plant through Yatra, very much specifically, were being rediscovered by communities who'd been making use of it traditionally, who weren't including the hallucinogenic dimension of the MAOI. Since the first travel Yatra did to Brazil, now many Jurema cults have originated, and a New Age movement involving the plant now exists. Which is why we see it's not really a pharmahuasca, but it is sort of an ayahuasca analog that we see on with people like me and people all over who are conducting these experiments themselves and posting them on websites like Erowid. So that's the end of our article by the author Luna. Now, something I'd like to mention is that what's most intriguing to me as a psychedelic enthusiast and literary poet, this is something I'm going to talk about in another video. It's a funny flip happening between ayahuasca and Jurema, which I plan to detail more later in my own work and research. So what we kind of see here is the difference between Mimosa Hostilis and ayahuasca. Mimosa Hostilis needs an MAOI like Syrian rue, which means Mimosa Hostilis itself actually contains DMT. Now, what most people are shocked to hear is that ayahuasca doesn't actually have DMT in it. Ayahuasca contains the beta-carbolines that activate the DMT in something called chacruna, Psychotra viridis. So it's when ayahuasca in itself is kind of inert, it does cleanse the body, and it does contain what's called these beta-carbolines, and that's harmaline, which was once called telepethine, as well as having various sort of wide-spectrum molecular properties that, when taken in the body with just pure ayahuasca, it does have a purging effect, and some say a spirit can come through the ayahuasca just by itself. But the Psychotria viridis brings which has DMT. See, this chacruna plant actually has DMT in it. And it's the DMT that gives the visionary experience. What's interesting is that ayahuasca itself, the root, doesn't contain DMT, right? The ayahuasca root is ground into a fine powder, and it's the deity, the barky root of the ayahuasca. In a shamanic context, the shaman speaks to the spirit of ayahuasca. And it's awakened in one's nervous system when it scrubs the bowels and intestines of the digestive tract along with this DMT plant, Psychotria viridis. So that barky spirit of the ayahuasca is the brew which shamans and practitioners intend to commune with ayahuasca. Now, on the contrary, with Jurema is different. Jurema is the Mimosa Hostilis. This is the barky root, which is ground into a fine powder, this purple powder, or pulverized. Doesn't need necessarily be a powder, but it's pulverized however you got to do it. It's brewed in a pot. It's brewed into water over a long period of time. And the essence of the plant, the powder, goes into that brew, which is then filtered. You squeeze out all the goods out of the raw bark matter, and then you leave kind of the bark matter behind. The Mimosa Hostilis, which is Jurema, that is the spirit. That is the deity that the shamans intend to commune with and speak through. The Mimosa Hostilis is the one that contains TMT. And it's activated by an MAOI, like Syrian root. So hopefully you can see the difference here. Jurema is the plant teacher whose spirit moves the experience, and Jurema is the one that contains the DMT. So in other words, with ayahuasca, the main plant spirit acts through the beta-carboline of ayahuasca, but not the DMT, which makes it an earthier experience. You know, you could almost say, I'm talking about another video where ayahuasca works on like the hypothalamus and the old lizard brain, whereas Jurema works through DMT. Jurema, the plant spirit of Jurema, actually is a DMT-containing plant, which means the spirit of Jurema actually operates through the spirit molecule, DMT, which relates to consciousness, which relates to the neocortical cortex, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the human intelligence principle that's a more recent evolutionary development in the human brain. That's what DMT kind of works through. So to one who has worked with these plants, this is a remarkable and very notable difference. Makes their operation and their spiritual operation in the human body completely different, especially when they hit the digestive tract, working with their particular partner compound. So I hope this brought some clarity as to what Jurema is. Jurema is a very special plant. I've used it myself. I've used it about 3 times now. It's a quirky, garrulous, very talkative spirit. It's become one of my deepest plant allies with its jungle jaguar energy. I hope that there comes to be more interest in Jurema, that it becomes as popular as it deserves to be, and that people take interest in its medicinal and spiritually medicinal and healing properties and qualities. It's one of the reasons why I do videos like this. So thank you so much for watching, everybody. My name's Dustin Cormier. Stay tuned for more videos on medicines in general of the ancient plant world, but also particularly certainly more videos describing my experiences and other articles surrounding Jurema. Take care.